Hello, good evening. I hope you're well. This is the third session of the qualitative research methodology sessions that you've had. The first two sessions looked at some principles related to qualitative research. I introduced you to the various traditions within qualitative research. I spoke a little bit about the different traditions. You may recall the session focused on phenomenology, ethnography, looked at biographical research, looked at narrative analysis, looked at participatory action research, grounded theory, and the case study. And of course, we looked at historical research, and I basically introduced you to all those. Then we spent some time working through some of the data requirements that are associated with research in general, and I tried to pick out examples that relate to qualitative research. So, and then this final very, very short presentation just looks at some of the key data collection options that are available within qualitative research. You'll remember I spoke about the things that people look at when they're making decisions about what to choose, the whole issue of obtrusiveness in relation to your data collection tool, the quantifiability of that tool, the level of structure associated with that tool, and so forth. That you will find in the previous presentation. Right now, this is exclusively about looking at the various data collection options that are available. I will turn off my my video now and just go straight into the presentation. Once again, do remember that you will get a full soft copy version of this emailed to you. This presentation here is just to walk you through some of the things you ought to think about when you think about these options. Right. Okay, so we're doing a very quick overview of some of the qualitative data collection approaches and tools that are out there. In essence, within qualitative research, there are four typologies and groups of data collection approaches that are available to you as researchers. The first is observations, which I did speak about in my previous presentation, but we will look at some of the ways that people describe and talk about their intended observation. Just as a point of note, and you would have noticed this with everything research, is that there might be generic typologies, and then within those types that I discuss, there will be differentiating descriptions. So like in observations, you will see that there are participating observers, then there are non-participating observers, and so forth. So you may have an observation, but the observation will need to be described in relation to the type of observation that you will do or you can do. So we will look at observations. We will then look at interviews and questionnaires. We will look also at documents as a mode of data collection. And also then we look at audiovisual materials. Of course, as always, I have the disclaimer that these introductory elements of options that I offer to you are just to open your eyes to the possibilities. I do, of course, touch on advantages and limitations of each of the approaches, but generally speaking, my advice to you all is that once you have an approach or you have content that you think is particularly relevant to you, then you follow it on beyond this session, because you will find that in as much as we try to cover all the detail here, people who have a specialist interest may want more than what is offered within this presentation. Okay, so the first type of data collection approach that is available to us in qualitative research is wait a minute, let us look at this now, is the observations. And observations really relate to the process of gathering open-ended first-hand information, by observing people and places at a research site. So basically with observations, what the point of it all is that you are literally saying that the form of data that you collect will be exclusively the recording of what you have seen. So you don't ask specific questions or anything like that. You actually just spend your time observing things. And remember, one of the philosophies of qualitative research is this idea that you observe things in their naturalistic settings. So with observation, it's much like that. But of course, there are different types. There are different types of observers, and we will speak a little bit more about that as we proceed. Of course, this whole thing of, or the idea of observation is not one that is viable for every circumstance. There will be times and situations where trying to observe the phenomena you're studying is not feasible, neither is it likely to reveal anything that would otherwise be not revealed through other modes of data collection. So I know many people will think, well, observation seems like an easy, trouble-free way of gathering data, but it comes with quite a lot of challenges because of the whole huge level of interpretation that goes on. And you will know this. You can literally, attend a car accident, be a witness to a car accident, and ask the first 10 people that you see what it is that they thought happened. And in all likelihood, you will find very different accounts. So that then speaks to the reliability of us using observations. But in saying that, there may be circumstances where the only viable way of collecting any data is through observation. So it is a method that can be utilized, but it comes with quite a lot of questions and concerns about reliability, validity, and so forth. Right. So when people talk about observation, the way that they differentiate the type of observation that may be happening is by referring to the role that is played by the observer. So you may have an observer that is considered to be a participant observer, and that is an observer who, in which the researcher has themselves agreed or is going to take part in the activities that they are in effect observing. So take sometimes there are people who will, and this is quite often in ethnographic studies, where people will go undercover, as it were, to study the behavior of certain cultures, certain social groups. And in that time, they will pretend to be a member of the group they are studying. And of course, that pretense requires that they also take part. and as they take part, they observe. So they are considered to be participant observers. Then the other alternative is this non-participant observer. This relates to an observer who may visit a site or a place where they believe they want to observe the phenomena that is going on, and they would not take part in it, but just record notes without being involved in the activities that are related to the phenomena that they are observing in the participants. So a typical example of a non-participant observer is sometimes there are people who want to study the culture of how certain services treat people. So they might decide that they want to go to an accident and emergency room to see how the staff there receive people who have alcohol misuse problems, for example. So they will go in and just sit in the casualty department and pay attention to how the different types of presenting patients are treated. They don't necessarily have to themselves come in as participants who are also, intoxicated and so forth. But that is a non-participant observer. So, of course, there are differentiating reasons why one would prefer to be one thing more than the other. You will remember that we speak about this concept of obtrusiveness. Of course, someone who's a participant observer is likely to camouflage themselves quite well in such ways that the people that they're observing will most likely continue to act normally or naturally without feeling that they are being looked at. So that's the advantage of participating and observing at the same time. But of course, the limitation of that is that if you participate and you observe, there are some things that you're less likely to see because your attentions are split between trying to be an authentic participant while you are also trying to be a complete observer. Then, of course, the non-participant observer, some people will say, look, this can have disadvantages in that if you enter a room and it is clear that you are watching people, then the expectation is that those people will modify their behavior so they align much more with what they think you are expecting to see, or they do what they believe you would consider to be the normal behavior you expect from them. So all these challenges and different motivations exist for why one option and not the other. The final observational role or possibility is one where people will talk about a changing observational role. So this is researchers who may decide that the situations that they're looking at are so dynamic that there are times where they are required to be participants and times where they are required to be just non-participating in their observation role. Of course, this carries with it both the limitations and advantages of both a participant observer and a non-participant observer, but it is a viable option that has been utilized specifically in the very dynamic research context where it is impossible for the observer to adopt one singular position, so forth. Okay. Now, the next example, that a data collection method that I need to orientate you to is, as you can see, the interview. Of course, interviews can occur in different contexts. There's firstly, if you think about the structure of interviews, there was what you may remember Earlier on, I spoke about the different type of dimensions that one has to consider when they think of a data collection approach. And one of them was the level of structure related to that approach. So you will all know that when we speak about interviews, we speak about unstructured interviews. And these are interviews where a person or a researcher will engage with one or more people, and I will differentiate how what happens if there's more than one interviewee. But you can carry out an interview where a researcher has a verbal dialogue with one person or more, in which they ask intentional questions related to the phenomena that they're interested in. Those questions may be presented as clearly listed, open-ended questions. So you may actually do an interview where you have listed questions that are open-ended for qualitative research, but if it was for quantitative research, they would be closed. So for qualitative research, there are open-ended questions, but when we refer to structure, the structure is to do with the fact that you might have 10 defined questions that you will ask, and you will stick to that structure and to those specific questions with all the participants. That is structured interview. A semi-structured interview, which is the other type of structure level that exists with interviews, is the case where a person may have 10 defined items that they want to ask, but they will be willing to prompt people differently if they need to look at that. They may also agree to pursue emerging themes that they had not anticipated. So if someone answers you in a way that you had not anticipated, but you feel that their answer is important and close to the concept that you're interested in, you would pursue that. And if the next participant didn't do that, you would of course have a different type of question format with that person. But that is semi-structured. So there was an initial structure in that you had the 10 specified question, but there is flexibility in relation to how you respond to emerging interesting phenomena within the interview, or how you prompt and dig further for things. Then, of course, the last option is what we refer to as the unstructured interview. This you may be familiar with what people sometimes call the grand tour question. And the grand tour question basically is the most type of open-ended question someone would ask, where basically you have an interview about a phenomena that you're interested in, but rather than having 10 pre-designed questions to ask, you just have one question that opens the conversation about what you're interested in, and then you will build on that depending on the responses you get. So a typical example of an unstructured interview would be something like this. Say if you were interested in how individuals experience their life as students, but you were interested in you had some ideas about what you're interested in, but you didn't want to fix your respondents to those ideas. You could begin your interview by just saying, can you tell me a little bit about your experience as a student? And of course, some students would talk about their experience in terms of the academic hardships. Some might talk about their financial and economic challenges. Some might talk about how they experience their peers, their other students. That open-ended question has allowed for very different answers to come back to you. And as those answers come back, you will be on you'll be on the hoof creating questions that are guided by the responses that you received. So those are unstructured interviews. Now, so far I've spoken about interviews. So far I've spoken about interviews in relation to it being a researcher asking one or more persons. So if you do an interview where there's one person, we typically would call that an individual interview. And then once you do interviews where there are groups of people that you are engaging with, then we refer to those as focus group discussions. Of course, there are different guidelines about what the size of a focus group discussion should be. Typically, they would talk about focus group discussions as being anything between 5 to 8 participants in a single group. There are different types of focus groups. One focus group could be a focus group with the same type of individuals who have the same characteristics. Sometimes you look for a focus group with individuals that are from different parts of that phenomena that you're interested in. I'll just put this simply. So if, say, we were studying the experiences of students and we thought that we could get valuable insights from students and from their families and also from lecturers, we could have focus groups that we set up, where some of the focus groups will just have students on their own, lecturers on their own, family members on their own. But sometimes people will go for a mixed focus group, where the focus group is made up of some students, some lecturers, and some family members. And all of these decisions that you make, remember, with researchers, I've always said no decision is just incidental or coincidental. It always has to do with a system of thinking. It always has to do with an intentional, logical approach that you've utilized. So take, for example, if someone were to join people up so that you have the same people from the same group in one focus group. If we wanted to have a focus group with just students alone, you could say that's the reason you've chosen it, and you've chosen it because the matters that are being discussed are sensitive, and you believe that the presence of individuals who belong to other groups, such as parents and as teachers, might negatively influence the participants' honesty in relation to their experience. You may, of course, decide that you want to join the students with teachers and with parents, and you're saying maybe you're doing that because in real life, the world of the student is such that they interface with teachers, they interface with their families, and you want a focus group engagement that mimics the naturalistic appearance of this phenomena. So both those are defenses, but they're defenses for different choices. One defense was to support a homogeneous focus group. The other defense was to support a heterogeneous focus group. Remember, the terms homogeneous and heterogeneous are terms that we spoke about much earlier on when I was presenting quantitative research. So they things that should really be familiar to you when they are mentioned in this context. Of course, as I've said, with each of these approaches, I detail some of the advantages. None of the advantages and disadvantages are in their nature rocket science, really. They are things that if you stand back from the particular data collection approach and you really think about it, they are quite predictable, conclusive statements. So examples with interviews. They provide very useful information that you can validate and check because you have someone right in front of you that you can question and clarify things with. And of course, because of that level of engagement and interrogation, they offer comparatively much more detailed information than other types of possibilities. If you were to observe people or you were to ask them to complete questionnaires, they may not give you the same detail as an interview would. Disadvantages, of course, remember with these engagements, the interviewer's personality, their way of seeing the world will permeate through to what it is that they report back. So one of the disadvantages of interviews is that the things that are recorded as being important are filtered through the viewpoints and value system of the interviewer. So some interviewers will downplay certain things by virtue of who they are and what they've come from. So there's issues about the accuracy potential of this or the likely bias that can be introduced into the process. And then, of course, look, when we talk about obtrusiveness, we know that once with interviews or interviews, the interviewee is absolutely certain that they are being interviewed and their information will be specifically used. So it is quite a rife space for people to offer responses that they think align with what the researcher wants to hear. So sometimes with interviews, people will, the allegation is that interview data is such that it is modified by the participant to be acceptable by the interviewer. And all sorts of things come into play. Imagine if you were being interviewed about how you experience the teaching that you get, and the interviewer was actually one of the teachers. That the existence of that pressure would mean that you modify your responses so you align with whatever you think they're expecting from you. And then, of course, I have spoken about how the interview is in some ways shaped by the nature, expertise, the role, then the appearance of coercion that's associated with the interviewer. But do remember that also the how articulate or inarticulate an interviewee is will determine whether they give you the information that you need. So all those things are issues that make the interview process somewhat disadvantageous. Right, I have given some examples here of interview types. Of course, there are one-to-one interviews, and I've spoken to those. Then there are focus group interviews, which I've also spoken to. Then, of course, particularly during this COVID-19 era, we have been reminded much more about the use of online interviews, telephone interviews, and so forth. So all those are options that are available to you. I will just let the slide stay up for a minute or so you can just assimilate these quite self-explaining interview options. Right. And finally, the last type of qualitative data collection methods that are available, or tools that can be used, relate to documents. Now, with documents, of course, people will talk about it in terms of documentary analysis. Some people will talk about it and call it retrospective analysis of documents. Some people will talk about documentary trawl, spelled TRAWL. So those are the different ways in which you can look at this, but it can be anything from minutes of meetings, from clinical records, from records of other raw data from other data collection processes and so forth. Of course, they too have advantages and disadvantages. One of um, the advantages of documents is that they are already existing and written in a language and a preference that the participants had, because when they wrote this, they obviously were writing in their naturalistic space. They didn't try to modify their language for you, the researcher. These documents are expressed in the way that those participants want to express themselves without them knowing that a researcher will eventually look at these. Of course, documents are also useful in that they're easy to analyze, and they save you one step. Everything that you would have got through audio means, things like interviews, focus group interviews, all of them need to be transcribed into documents for you to be able to analyze them. But documents are already transcribed, so they are that much more efficient to turn into findings because they are halfway in the format that you want. Of course, disadvantages are, as we know, that records are incomplete for all sorts of reasons, and that incompleteness can mean there are challenges for you in claiming that you have really taken full account of all the accounts that are available, because sometimes some of the documents are missing or whatever. Of course, access to documents, as you know, is something that is a privilege that becomes much, much more difficult to access, and you will find that potential data sources become more concerned when you ask for documentary insight than if you ask to speak to people. So you could literally, I mean, if you think about this, you could sit with someone and ask them to give you their date of birth, and they would be very happy to provide that orally. But by comparison, if you were to explicitly request that as a document, you would find that there might be many more restrictions for you as a data collector. Then, of course, information around documents, apart from the sensitivity people have with releasing documents, information may be located in distant archival material. There's lots of researcher-related travel expenses and so forth. And generally speaking, people have to move to the documents. You can't negotiate that the documents move to you. There's a lot that has been written about the fact that what people record in documents is not necessarily authentic, it's not necessarily complete, it is not necessarily accurate. In many cases, people are socialized to report on documents what they believe they should record and not what they really believe is happening. So that poses a particular challenge in terms of authenticating the accuracy of what it is that you have in front of you. And of course, not all documents are typescript, some are handwritten, and that of course introduces the whole dynamic of whether they're legible or not. Then finally, audiovisual materials. These consist of images or sounds that researchers collect to help them understand the phenomena that they're interested in. So literally, this is the same as it gives you the same dimensions of access as having a face-to-face interview, but the material can't speak to you, it can't be queried, you can't ask it to clarify itself and so forth. And I think once you kind of appreciate that difference, many of the advantages and disadvantages become self-revealing. And I will share some of them. So for a start, images, as you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So people generally relate much more easily to images and so forth. And in many ways, they can capture more through pursuing imagery rather than by using some of the limited dimensions that are available in audio only or observational only opportunities. And then, of course, there are many ways in which people can use images as a way of communicating material that is sometimes too difficult for them to communicate in any other context. But similarly, as with all approaches, they do have disadvantages. They are very difficult to analyze because of the explosion of and concentration of information that is evident in one image. You can look at a single image and there will be so many things that we see, and by that same variation, what one researcher may see may not be seen by the next. So that whole variance of it being so dependent on how good the visualizing researcher is, it all comes into play. And of course, with audiovisual images, or with all the data that you collect, there are inclusion and exclusion criteria that have to be applied, and sometimes the application of specific inclusion and exclusion criteria means that important things that needed to be seen may have been missed. And of course, sometimes people will ask individuals to create images, and then they analyze those images as if they are data. But that instruction of creating an image already carries with it a judgment by you, the researcher, that you believe your phenomena can be explained using that type of image that you've dictated should be created. So in a way, if you ask people to paint something very specific, you are literally saying you believe that the phenomena can be best explained by that thing that you want to have painted. And that is an unnecessary preloading of your own views and your own values and your own impressions, when really you're trying to discover things without imposing yourself on it. Look, there's a lot more to be said around each of the data collection approaches, but I think essentially what I have shown you are the 4 key areas of data collection approaches. I've exposed you to some of their limitations and some of their strengths. I've spoken a little bit about the considerations you have in relation to structure, quantifiability, obtrusiveness, and so forth. And I think those are a great foundational mix to allow you to pursue additional readings. The readings that I've put here will give you a lot more information around the different data collection approaches. And remember, as you think of your data collection approaches, you must also think of this issue of and the tradition you're pursuing. So if you are pursuing a tradition such as phenomenology, where the interest is to get insider perspectives, you would find that trying to get insider perspectives using audiovisual materials will not work. The only direct things that work are direct engagement with participants. So you become limited to interviews, and in many respects, individual face-to-face interviews are the only option. So just remember that you don't just pick a data collection method without thinking about which of the qualitative designs or traditions you have aligned with, because each of them have pre-existing assumptions, rules that will inevitably exclude some things and include others. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I can safely say that we have covered the whole range of things that relate to qualitative research designs and data collection methods. And I request that you watch these videos that I have presented to you in succession, so that you're able to actually relate one presentation to the next, because as you have noticed, I do relate what I taught you in the earlier presentation to what I may be presenting at that particular time. I thank you for your interest. I hope that you found this session particularly helpful, and look forward to seeing you when I do the final in this series, the mixed methods research designs presentation. Thank you.